Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 178, IO 535b to D. The poets interpret the words of God for some reason, although God speaks through the poets. For some reason, Socrates is now portraying the poets as if they interpret, perhaps simply they expound. The verb hermeneuo may be understood to mean expound rather than interpret, and it probably does make more sense here. But then Socrates says that the rhapsodes interpret or expound the poets. So again, we should go with expound, so that they do the same sort of thing. They speak and wave their hands about, that sort of thing. And this leads Socrates to conclude that the rhapsodes are expounders of expounders, which doesn't sound so interesting as interpreters of interpreters, but never mind. And Io is delighted with this conclusion. But Socrates, being Socrates, doesn't stop with a conclusion. He then checks the conclusion. This is part of dialectic training, even though Io doesn't know that is what's happening. Echede moi tode epeo ion, kai me apokrypse hotiadse ero mai. But hold and tell me this, Io, and don't hide whatever I ask you. Socrates didn't have to ask Io not to hide anything when he asks him a question, but it does, I think, add to the idea that Io is in some way mystical. He carries on the transmission of divine words from the god through the poet and through the rhapsode to the audience. If so, we should regard Socrates as asking Io to reveal the mysteries, and this would be flattering to Io. Socrates continues, Hotan iu epes epe kai ekplexes malista tus theomenus, ton Odyssea hoton epiton udon ephalomenon ades, ekphene gignomenon tois mnestersi, kai ekcheonta tus oistus proton podon, Achillea epiton Hectora hormonta, kaiton periandromachen elenonti, peri hecaben, peri priamon, tote potron emphron, exosautu gigne, kai paratois pragmasin oietai suenai, psyche hois leges enthusiadzusa, en Ithake usin, en Troia, hopos an kai ta epe eche. Whenever you are wording your words well and you astound in particular the audience, whether you sing Odysseus leaping onto the threshold, becoming apparent to the suitors and pouring out the arrows in front of his feet, or Achilles moving against Hector, or one of the moving pieces about Andromache, or Hecabe, which is Hecuba, or about Priam. Are you then in your right mind, or do you become beside yourself? And does your soul, being inspired by the things you say, think that it is by the things you are talking about, whether they are in Ithaca or in Troy, or however the words are? Socrates had claimed that the poets don't have a techne because they lack intelligence, and he gave 3 analogies to explain why poets lack intelligence at the moment that they compose their good poems. And now, turning to the rhapsodes, it seems that he wants to establish the same thing, that the rhapsodes, at the moment that they are expounding the good poems of the poets, are lacking nous, or intelligence. He doesn't actually mention nous here. He simply asks Io if he is out of his mind when he expounds about various portions of the Odyssey or the Iliad. With the poets, Socrates gave 3 analogies to explain why poets lack techne or nous when they are expounding good poems, and these were the magnet, or rather the magnetic power, which expands from the divine magnet. A god or goddess is the magnet. The power of the magnet expands through the poet out to the rhapsodes, and from there to the audience. So they are all attracted back to the magnet. The second analogy involved bees and honey. The poet had to get rid of his intelligence in order to be light enough to fly up to the gardens of the Muses to discover the poems already there. So again, the poet himself needed no techne or intelligence. And thirdly, we had the god himself, basically Apollo this time, deliberately making sure that audiences knew that the poets were empty vessels through which the god spoke. Now, though, with the rhapsode, Socrates provides a 4th reason for the lack of intelligence at the time of expounding good poetry. And this is that the soul itself thinks that it is in the place which the rhapsode is talking about, be it Ithaca or Troy, or any other place mentioned in either of the poems. But not only this, Socrates also emphasizes the events taking place and the characters speaking or being talked about. And he's suggesting that the soul may identify with one or other character in an emotional way. So Socrates is asking Io whether he is in his right mind when he expounds poetry, or whether his soul is carried away by what he is saying and becomes emotionally involved. Does that mean that the soul is lacking intelligence at that moment? Because today we might say that the rhapsode actually manifests emotional intelligence. The rhapsode certainly doesn't need the intelligence for composition. That's already been done or not done by the poet and the god involved. The rhapsode simply needs to learn the lines, but then it seems to be that the emphasis here is on the method of exposition, the ability to infuse what is being said with emotion. And we might indeed go back to the idea that hermeneuo is to do with interpreting. The rhapsode is interpreting the poem in such a way that the audience will feel a particular emotion or set of emotions depending on the state of the rhapsode himself at the moment that he is expounding this good poetry. We should note that Socrates asks Io if he is of sound mind or out of his mind when he's expounding this poetry. So it's up to Io to decide whether he is out of his mind. Hos enargesmoi tuto o Socrates to tekmerion epes, ugar se apokrypsamenos ero. What clear evidence you have said, Socrates, for I will not hide it from you, and I will say, egogar hotan elenon ti lego, da kruon empimplantai mu hoi ophthalmoi, hotan te foveron e de non, orthai hai treches histantai hupophobu kai he cardia peda. For I, whenever I say something pitiful, moving, my eyes fill up with tears. And whenever I say something fearful or terrible, the hairs stand upright from fear and the heart pounds. From this description, we may infer that Io is indeed out of his mind when he expounds the Iliad or the Odyssey, but he hasn't said so explicitly. For this reason, Socrates now asks him again, Tiun, fomen o ion emphrona enai tote tutonton anthropon, hosan ke kosmemenos estheti poikile, kai chrysois Stephanois, clai ten thusiais kai heortais, meden apololekos tuton, e phobetai pleon ean dismuriois anthropois hestekos filiois, medenos apoduontos, medea dicuntos. What then, Io, are we to say that this man then is in his right mind, who, being ornamented with fancy clothes and with golden crowns, would cry, both in sacrifices and in feasts, not having lost any of these things? He means the fancy clothes and the golden crowns. The sacrifices and the feasts are where he would be performing, or who would be afraid while standing among more than 20,000 friendly people, no one stripping or doing anything unjust to him. Maton dia, panu, O Socrates, hos ketalithes erestai. No, Byzius, not quite, Socrates, truth be told. Io then is affirming that a rhapsode in such a condition is not in his right mind. He's also confirming that he, as a rhapsode, is in that condition when he is expounding Homer.